St. Augustine is the oldest city in the continental U.S. Our museum is located on the very oldest street in the continental U.S. And it's filled with a lot of really great, wonderful places. Of course, you're going to learn about the best one here in a moment. But we also have some other really great places as well. In the right corner there, that is Flagler College, the historic Ponce de Leon Hotel. And then they do historic tours of it. We both are graduates from Flagler College. And then, of course, we are a national landmark with the National Park Service, the Castillo de San Marco, our fort, and then with various other little places here and there. That right there is St. George Street, the big shopping area. Very old houses that are now like, you can buy dresses at, buy your sunscreen, sunglasses, things like that. So definitely come back, check us out. It only took us about, it was like an hour and 45-minute drive to get here, all through the country roads. It was really pretty. So it's a nice weekend getaway. And at the end of the tour, we do have a bunch of our flyers, things we're doing, but I also wanted to bring, this is done by our cultural council, that green flyer there, thank you. And so this has lists of events that are happening all the way from now up until the end of October. So you're welcome to come up, grab them, and just kind of share, just spend a weekend and visit us at the Ximenez-Fatio House Museum. So just a brief overall history. We're an old boarding house built in 1798. We've been female-owned since 1828. We're still female-owned today. And our ladies who own us today saved us from the wrecking ball in 1939, the National Society of Colonial Dames in the chapter of Florida. And we'll go over them a little bit later. But we really have a huge, rich history. It was built by a man, but really succeeded with women. And throughout history, all the stories, things that have been told, people, places, they all have been told through the perspective of men. And what makes our house really unique is, like I said, we've been female-owned since 1828. So while it's been first built by a man, it's really the females taking over, empowering it, and going from there, and we're still female-owned today. So one of my favorite quotes is from a very old romantic movie my mom and I loved when I was young. But I would say old, I think it came out in like 1999. I wasn't here in the 19th century. But I think it really encapsulates our museum. The man is the head, but the woman's the neck, and she can turn the head any way she wants. So you'll kind of see that in perspective later. So our house was built in 1798 by a Spanish merchant named Andre Ximenez. He comes from a little small town called Ronda, Spain, in southern Spain, come to La Florida, told Florida's a newish Spanish territory, come make your fortune. Reality, it's a big swamp. However, he still stays here. His wife, Juana, who was a Menorcan of the area. Has anyone heard the word Menorcan before? A few of you? Well, for those of you who haven't, a Menorcan, they come from the island of Menorca off the coast of Spain. There's also people from the coastal Italy, Greek islands. And in the 1760s, there's a man named Dr. Andrew Turnbull. He goes to those places and says, hey, if you come back with me to New Smyrna as indentured servants for 7 years, I'll clothe you, feed you, house you, all of that. Well, they come, and about within the first year, half the population dies off. Starvation, there were native attacks, and the working conditions were horrible. They were lied to, basically, and treated as enslaved persons. Well, 7 years comes and goes, a decade comes around, and they realize they're fed up with this. Their population is dwindling very much. And 3 of their Menorcan leaders marched a 73-mile journey from New Smyrna Beach all the way up to St. Augustine to petition with the governor of Florida there in St. Augustine, who already was not a fan of Turnbull, which was pretty great for them. And they said, of course, come by. We'll grant you land, which is now the top part of St. George Street. If any of you have been there, the St. Augustine, the original city gates, that was their territory that they're granted. They go back down, they gather most of their population, their people, and they walk that journey. And the 3 men, they only did that in 3 days.
Wow.
And we have Juana Pellicer. This is not a photo, a drawing of her, but it is to represent just who a traditional Menorcan woman, how she would have dressed, what she looked like. And she was the daughter of one of those 3 leaders, Francisco Pellicer. And she is born in New Smyrna, but just as a toddler, she comes up to St. Augustine, where she's supposed to grow into a very prominent lady. until she's married off at 15 to Andre Ximenez, when he is 38 years old. Weird for us today, probably still a little bit odd back then, but more normalized. As far as we know, they have an okay relationship together, and they have 5 children. Well, they have this house. They built it in 1798, and we really believe that it was Francisco Pellicer, who was a trained carpenter, that helped to build the property. And they run it pretty suspiciously, I cannot speak, for a few years together. They run a general store, tavern, and a billiards hall in the first floor. Now, it is a 3-story building, and this photo, there. So when they built the property, it is this portion and the whole bottom floor. Those rooms were not added on with our last funeral owner. We'll go over her later. So they built it and they operate it pretty well. Now the marriage between Juana and Ximenez, it would have been a really great feat in town. Of course, the Spanish, the British had been gone before, now the Spanish is back in. But when you're a Spanish person, you just marry another Spanish person. And so their marriage was blending those two cultures together. The Norcans, they're newer in town, people are weary of them. So if you marry, one of the most beautiful young ladies of the leader of the community to a wealthy merchant, it's blending that together. And we'll go over more of that with the preservation. And they have it pretty well for a while until Juana passes at the age of 26 from either yellow fever or childbirth. The youngest 2 Ximenez children also pass away from yellow fever within the same year. Yes, the remaining children who do live to adulthood, they move themselves to Cuba, Key West area, and eventually sell the shares of the house to our first female owner, Margaret Cook. Now, Margaret Cook is a wealthy young lady from Charleston, South Carolina. She's married off to a man named Archibald at 15 years old, just how everyone kind of did back then. And he's a tailor just in downtown Charleston. As far as we know, they have 1 child together. Her name's Elizabeth Margaret, and they just have a great business together until just a few years after he does pass away. She remarries to another tailor who actually worked on the same street as her first husband, so they possibly knew each other pretty well, within less than a year after Archibald dies, and his name is Samuel Cook. And so they are just running business together. But in 1821, Florida becomes this American territory, and business booms in Florida. You have Jacksonville that's starting all their big hotels. Henry Flagler is not here yet. He eventually comes in the 1880s. But there's still a rise of tourism. People want to escape here. They also tend to escape with tuberculosis. Florida's myth, legend, it's going to heal you with the humidity. Completely false. But people are coming here, and there's a desperate need for housing. And that's where the rise of boarding houses really start to come through. So Margaret is our first female owner. She moves here with her daughter and Samuel. They're just as business people. Samuel serves as a postmaster, and he passes away just, I believe, a year or so after they moved down here. So Margaret is married, widowed, married, and widowed, all before she's 30 years old. And there was a rare business opportunity for widowed women back then. If you were just a single lady, it was very, very hard to own a business, own any rights, essentially. But because Margaret was widowed, she had that rare right to own property. And her first husband, they never have any sons together, so Elizabeth eventually inherits, but she's still just less than 10 years old. She's still very young. And so Margaret inherits everything herself from her first 2 marriages. And she takes that money, and between the death and the grief of her husbands, sees this as opportunity for herself. And she eventually purchases the shares of our Coquina house in 1825, renovates it for a few years, opens it up, gets all the property deeds, all of that together, and opens the house in 1830. And she also comes with another widow from Charleston. Her name is Eliza Whitehurst. She's recently widowed. She moves down here with her son, Dr. Daniel Whitehurst, who has a very brief connection with Osceola, and her daughter, Anna. They live in the house for a little bit. Eliza Whitehurst becomes her property manager. And between the 2 of them, the house thrives. We have records that there's in certain diaries that it's noted to be Mrs. Whitehurst's boarding house. When it is not hers, it's Margaret Cook's. That's okay. We either think they were sisters or sister-in-laws. There's some sort of familial connection, but within documents, it's really hard to finalize what that is. But they run it pretty successfully for 8 years. Eliza Whitehurst does pass away in our boarding house. And eventually after that, Margaret realizes after her daughter herself does pass away, we believe in childbirth, the house just kind of sits here. I don't have anything to do with it, Margaret's dead, Eliza Whitehurst has passed away, and she just moves to her son-in-law's plantation up in Jacksonville. And so from then, she eventually does give the house to her second female owner, sells it to Sarah Petty Anderson. And Sarah Petty Anderson, we do know a nice amount about her. There's lots of records. Within the past year, we actually came over a book of her whole family that's about this thick. And we're reading through it, finding more things about her, but we know she was born in North Carolina, but she was raised in the West Indies. So anywhere from basically the Caribbean area. And she's very wealthy. She grows up in the West Indies and eventually marries who we have noted, her fairy prince, George Anderson, in Turks and Caicos. They have 4 children together, but there's a rise for opportunity in Florida. It's basically the same climate, you'll get used to it. Let's go to Volusia County today, Ormond Beach, Daytona. And they have over 3,000 acres on 2 plantations, and their fortune rises from there. Well, they run it pretty successfully till George dies in the 1830s. And she does have a couple sons, but they're not old enough to inherit all the land yet. So she sells those 2 properties, and she has a third one in Volusia County called Dunlawton. And Dunlawton is this giant plantation, your main cash crops, things like that. She does have a large amount of enslaved persons as well. It's noted in the census records. And it runs successfully for a while until Christmas Eve, I believe, of 1835. During the Second Seminole War, the Seminoles go through and they burn down and tear down every plantation along the St. Johns River, including Dunlawton. So they flee elsewhere. The closest big, starting to thrive community is St. Augustine. And because she is widowed, she does have a large amount of money. With her being able to own property, she purchases our house and keeps it on as a boarding house. Her money's dwindling because everything burned down, was torn down, and so she sees that as the opportunity for her and her children to make a nice amount of money. And so she purchases in 1838 and keeps it on for about a decade. She eventually does sell the house to her property manager, Ximenez-Fatio, which is our last female owner, and we know the most about her, and I'll talk about her in a second. And Sarah eventually moves to Tallahassee, where her descendants still live today. She does pass away there. The only item that's owned in our museum is her mirror. It's a very large cheval mirror, about this tall, really beautiful, and it was just passed down from one of her descendants in the 1970s for the museum. So if you come to visit us, everything you see in the house is not original, but it is to the time period. The colonial dames who own us today, when they went to turn the house into the museum from 1939 to 46, they did their research. They had donations, they went to antique stores, and that's how we're able to very, very closely almost connect the date and ownership of every single one of our items. Now, if you have questions about that, we have our lovely archivist here. So, our last female owner, Ximenez-Fatio, she is pictured there. We do have 2 photos. My favorite one I'll show you in a minute. And she comes from a very wealthy plantation called New Switzerland, which is a very small suburb today of Jacksonville. And she's the oldest daughter of Francis Philip Fatio Jr., and this huge plantation is huge. They have their main cash crops, lots of tobacco, indigo, sugar, and it thrives for years. She does have a few younger sisters, 1 younger brother, and she's given, because she's very wealthy, that formal education. She's classically trained on the piano, the spinet piano. She's knows fluently 4 languages: English, Spanish, French, and Italian. We have census records showing how tall she was, what she looked like. In the 1864 census, she's 5 foot tall, blue eyes, and a light complexion. And with the photo there, it really shows you. And with the Second Seminole War, in Christmas of 1835, their plantation is one of the ones along the river that's burned down. And her father does pass away in that house fire, and because he's so wealthy, although everything burned down, his money's in banks. And we do have records of his will, which basically lists Louisa as almost the sole inheritor of everything. She does have a younger brother. We have no idea why. Whether she was the favorite child, the only one who cared about him, cared about business, we really don't know. There are dowries left to her other siblings. A large portion does go to her younger brother, but she's basically inherits so much of it. And she never marries, she never has any children, so she's expected to go live with one of her brother-in-laws, because her father's passed, for the rest of her life, and be technically just owned by a man. And she says, absolutely not. That's a nightmare. And because she takes the money, she goes and she makes an incredible life for herself. When the house burns down in 1835, her family flees to Fernandina Beach, which is on the coast, on the border of Florida and Georgia. And then she moves to St. Mary's, Georgia. She kind of moves all around and eventually settles in St. Augustine, I believe in about her late 20s, early 30s. And because she's a young lady, she's very pretty, maybe she had a lot of suitors. There's a record, kind of a rumor, it's not certain, that she was engaged to a British officer. We don't know what happened to him. They were never officially married. But with that money, she takes this opportunity for herself. She eventually does manage a house on the bayfront of St. Augustine, a boarding house. And then she purchases another boarding house on St. George Street and runs that for the majority of her life. Eventually settles in our property as the property manager under second female owner, Sarah Petty Anderson, and then eventually purchases the house from her in 1851. From 1851 to 55, she adds on the entire second story part of it. She probably extends the land even more up to St. George Street. We know that's historically a huge farming land, basically. Goats, chickens, all of that. And she owns it with her sister Sophia, who we do not have a photo of, but they managed the boarding house together for about 20 years. Ximenez-Fatio lives until she's 79 years old, which for back then was pretty good. And she does have enslaved persons the entirety of the 1800s, and that leads us to the invisible hands. We cannot talk about the women of our house, our property in general, without talking about them. They are the people who were enslaved, who were servants, who were paid at one point after the Civil War, who functioned the house, that controlled all of it. And without them, nothing would have functioned sufficiently. So we do have records of every owner, including the Ximenez, all the way to Louisa, that owned enslaved persons. And under the case of the Ximenez family, we know they at least had one woman who we talk about daily on our tours. She's recorded in the census records as a mulatto woman, half white, half black. She's in her early 30s. Her name is Rosa. Rosa, her entire job is to manage the general store. So she's an enslaved woman operating, selling, trading, and buying goods. Within managing the general store, which was the grocery store in St. Augustine, she's also taking care of the youngest Ximenez children who passed away from yellow fever, and her youngest daughter, her only daughter, Felicitas. Now, under the Spanish, it has a very different form of slavery of what many of us grew up learning, the American plantation system. Under the Spanish, one was not enslaved due to the color of their skin, but to their religion. They weren't seen as chattel, they were seen as people who had souls, who could be saved in the Catholic Church, baptized, who could petition for their freedom, things like that. It's very, very different from the chattel system. And when the Ximenez family come in, when they build the property, it's under the second Spanish period. So Rosa is an enslaved woman under the Spanish. We actually have records that she was basically married to another enslaved man on another property. We have records of her daughter, Felicitas. Felicitas does die in infancy. We have her baptism record. We have her birth certificate and her death certificate. Rosa is an enslaved woman. Felicitas is born free because Rosa gets her baptized within a few days of her birth. And so that's a huge difference. And we also have Ximenez-Fatio, we have on the census records with their full names, their ages, and kind of what skill they had, if they're strong, if they're good with labor, if they're good with laundry, things like that. We have documented 6 enslaved people. Jean-Claude Liangle gave them to her, it's her brother-in-law. It's Amy, Dick, Mulatto John, Rachel, Lucretia, and Black John. And I'm sure there were a lot more people than just the 6 who were operating our house, but they're the ones who are in the census records as given to Louisa. And then we have the case of Louisa Williams and Louis Williams, and we actually have a picture of them. They grew up on the plantation of New Switzerland. Even though they have basically the same name, they are not related at all, which is kind of funny. And when Louisa, she eventually does join the Union when Florida starts Confederacy, very briefly, I believe, less than a year. And the Union comes in, it's Union for the rest of the war. And she does join the Union, and with that, she does free her enslaved persons. She gives them the option, of course, leave, or you can stay and I'll pay you. Though it's a very, very small amount, just enough to say she did, basically. So this is Felicitas, her baptism record, and we have Father Miguel O'Reilly, which is still the O'Reilly House today, the museum, you can tour it. He's the one who signed it. We do have the whole English translation as well. But with this, her mother's enslaved, she's born free, she's a black child in Spanish Florida. So the fact that we have her death certificate, birth, baptism record, it's pretty incredible. Everything has been digitized, papers, disintegrate over time, and that's why we really emphasize preservation on our property. Now this is my favorite picture of the entire house, because it shows Ximenez-Fatio here, the year that she died, when she's 79 years old in 1875. She's right there. And she also, these are all the guests of her property as well. This photo with the prominent guest with Louisa shows 5 people of color. And I think that's it's kind of odd that it's shown within the context. Oh, these are the guests of the house. These are their servants pictured as well. So we have this woman here. We do not know her name, unfortunately. We also have this man and this woman. This is Louis Williams, and this is Louisa Williams. And so we actually have a photo of her. We do of them. We know that they do leave our property probably together. The records end from there. We also have this person over here. Possibly someone looking out right here. We are not too sure to say that 100%. And we also have this young boy here as well. And I just think that's pretty incredible. I love to mention it. So our house is still female owned today. We're owned by the National Society of Colonial Dames of America in the chapter of Florida. They are the women that own and operate our property. From about the Gilded Age up until the late 1960s, there's a trend going throughout the country to destroy historical places. It's just an old building, it's falling apart, just get rid of it. We'll have something bigger and cool. Those of you who have been to St. Augustine, the Flagler College today, that was going to get torn down by the city of St. Augustine to turn into a literal parking garage. Until Henry Flagler's nephew comes in and says, no, that's a terrible idea, don't do that. And that's just an example. That's why we have Colonial Williamsburgs. The Rockefellers come in. Without them, everything would have ran down from there. And they are already here in the 1930s here because the city wanted to get rid of the original city gates at the top of St. George Street. And they raise the funds, they get the grants to save them, the petitions, and we've been owned from them since. So I will leave it at this, bring Emily in, but these are the 6 dames that learned the history of our house in 1939, the purchasing committee, and they're the ones who decide we really need to save this. And this is what the house looked like in 1939. And Emily?
So I'll talk a little bit about the preservation here at the house, why we're doing it, how we're doing it. One thing you might have noticed that Hannah mentioned is when the National Society of the Colonial Dames in Florida, when they purchased the house in 1939. So that's that's right in the Great Depression. So when you're thinking about it, it's why would people be going out of their way to spend all these extra sums of money? And really it's because in this time, a lot of historical sites were being demolished because people couldn't afford to save them. And these women really saw the importance in saving the house, and they decided to do everything they could to pull the money together to save the house. It also so happened when they looked at the house and actually purchased it, there were multiple families still living in the house, people renting out rooms in the house, and that was part of what helped them preserve the house, is the family staying there and the people renting businesses. That was additional income that they were making while they were trying to restore the house. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why they preserve it. Hannah already answered one of the biggest pieces of that, and that is the women's history. That's really what drew the women to the house in the first place. They're a women's organization themselves, obviously championing themselves on women's history and women's empowerment. So finding a business that was owned by women for almost 100 years, and single women at that too, was something really significant to them. So that's really what drew them there in the first place. The second side of it is also the architectural value of the house. Are any of you familiar, I know a lot of you visited St. Augustine, are any of you familiar with coquina? Few people. All right, so anyone who's not, Hannah's actually going to pass out an example of coquina stone here.
I also am going to pass around some things, pottery, a couple old nails that we have found on our archaeological digs. I do have count, so I will make sure we have you all make sure to feel the coquina and just keep passing it around.
Yeah, so she'll pass that around. Essentially, coquina is a naturally occurring stone in Florida. It's made pretty much sand, shell, lime. It's basically fossilized shells that have all been pressed down with sand and lime, so it is a limestone. Same stuff the big fort in St. Augustine is made of, so the Castillo de San Marcos is made of coquina. A lot of the old buildings and houses in St. Augustine are made of coquina, and then our house is made of coquina as well. So that was something significant because, well, then it was pretty significant too, but especially now, we're one of only 31 remaining coquina structures in St. Augustine. So there's not a lot of coquina structures left. While there is still coquina, it's not really available for quarrying the way it used to be. It's also really expensive to work with coquina preservation, which I'll get a little bit more into that later. But that was something that made our house stand out. There's not a lot of coquina structures throughout the United States or throughout the world because there's not a lot of coquina. I think if I remember correctly, there's 8 coquina quarries across the world. The coquina quarry that we in St. Augustine would be getting coquina from, it's the Anastasia quarry, runs from a little bit north of us, so we'll say like about Jacksonville, and then down to maybe like top of Palm Beach County, I would say. So it's a pretty rare building material, but it's a naturally occurring stone in Florida. So I always like to say our house is made of Florida. So excellent staple of Florida history. But our house is also a testament to a blend of cultures. In St. Augustine history, there were a lot of different people. You could even say the original melting pot in the United States. But there were Native Americans in Florida, the Spanish came in, then the British came in, the Menorcans showed up, the Spanish came back, then the Americans came in. With the Menorcans, there were many Greeks and Italians in that mix too. There's many recorded Germans living in early St. Augustine as well. So quite a lot of different cultures were here in St. Augustine, but when you look at our house and you look at the architecture, it's actually blending British, Spanish, American, and Menorcan ideas into the architecture itself. So it's kind of taking all the benefits and different influences from all the people who are in St. Augustine. You can kind of see like pictures of our windows. The windows we have, that's very British. The Spanish usually just had the bars over their windows, had it open. You can kind of see here in this little model of the house, this actually would be the front of the house here, and this would be the back. Having the courtyards in the back, very Spanish. So when you meandered around your house and in your courtyard, you had the privacy of being at the back. You could just open in right off the street. Those are just a couple little examples there, but Hannah had mentioned too, Francisco Pellicer, which was the father-in-law of our first owner. He was one of the leaders of the Menorcans, and he was a carpenter. So he probably actually helped to build the house. It was probably a lot of Menorcan craftsmen, as well as Spanish, who actually helped build and construct the house. So you can see that too, especially in the second Spanish period. One thing that's really unique with the Menorcans is I always say they're a group that stayed. So for the most part, Spanish were there. When the British came in, pretty much all the Spanish left. British are there. When the Spanish come back, all the British leave. When the Americans come in, all the Spanish leave. But the Menorcans stay. The Menorcans arrive in the British period. They stay when the Spanish come back, and then they stay through that transition as Florida becomes American territory. And even today, it's estimated 1 in 10 people living in St. Augustine today are of Menorcan descent. So probably like 20,000 people in St. Augustine are of Menorcan descent. So they're a group that stayed. Menorcan craftsmen probably helped build the house, but you can see in the way that houses are built in that second Spanish period, a lot of that architectural influence comes from the Menorcans, who basically lived and experienced both the British and Spanish architecture, and really helped influence, the best of both worlds in that. Some of that came from the Spanish too that are living there in the second Spanish period. They're getting to see some of the way the British maybe changed things up, and they decided, we'll steal some of that for our houses. We like that better. So architecture there has that blend of cultures. If you go into the interior of our house, the design, the fireplaces, very federal American design. So you can see all these different hands and all these different cultures just in how they touched really the physicality of the house. But our house and really the stories we tell just really help represent the blend of cultures in St. Augustine in general. We have to remember too, our women here in the house all had different backgrounds, but our 3 ladies owning the boarding house, it was a boarding house. So they had multitudes of different people coming in the house, staying in the house, whether you were an officer who needed a break from the barracks, whether you were a soldier recovering from wounds during the Seminole Wars, a sea captain just stopping in, or an artist in the 1870s who wanted to come down from the north and experience the different flora and fauna that we have here in Florida, see an alligator for the first time, whatever it was. You had all of these different people with different backgrounds coming in the house that the women were interacting with, and really affected the house and the people there and the stories that we tell today. So we want to preserve the house. Especially, I think it's become more apparent this year with the 250th and celebrating the Revolution and the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. America's made up of lots of different people. We're always referred to as a melting pot and having a lot of different cultures, or some of the things we love the most all pull from different places. But when we talk about the 250th and we talk about the Revolution, pretty rare that you hear Florida get talked about in that mix. It's not usually the focus. You don't really think about Florida in the Revolution, but Florida was certainly affected by it, and Florida certainly affected the Revolution itself. Florida was British at the time. Florida had chosen to remain loyal to the British, but the Spanish decided to help the Americans, and that's really how the Spanish got Florida back from the British. So if they didn't intervene, who knows, maybe Florida would still be British today. Like, who's to see what the trajectory would have been? But all these different people who are living here in Florida, we just did our own lecture series actually to highlight it. We talked about the fact, the way the Native Americans here were affected, the Africans here in Florida were affected, the Spanish, the British, the Menorcans, really how that all changed. Because when you look at the bigger whole of the American Revolution, I don't know how many of you have heard the saying, like, the age of revolutions, with the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the American Revolution. There was this wave of people wanting freedom, but it was happening in Florida too. The Menorcans came to St. Augustine for a reason. They wanted freedom. So they were escaping New Smyrna because they were basically being treated like slaves in New Smyrna. They escaped to St. Augustine, find freedom there, develop really nice lives there. They're still here in St. Augustine today. A little bit before that, we have what we now in St. Augustine really refer to as the flight to freedom. Are any of you familiar with Fort Mose in St. Augustine? It's the first legally sanctioned free black settlement, but essentially in the first Spanish period, any enslaved individuals under the British were basically told by the Spanish, if you can escape and you can make it down to Florida, if you agree to take up arms and convert to Catholicism, you'll be freed. So it was almost like the first underground railroad, but going south. So that happened even before the revolution. So there's pretty much all these things happening in this time where people are inspired by finding freedom and coming to St. Augustine, and it happening here in Florida. And really, we don't become American territory too much later. It's really only 50 years later that then Florida ends up becoming American itself. So when we look at the United States and we look at the 250th and all the cultures here and the people we're celebrating, if you zone in on St. Augustine, which is not a city, and Florida is not the state that comes up when you think about the revolution, you're actually looking at one of the most perfect examples of the blend of culture and that flight to freedom that we were seeing come out of the Revolutionary War and the founding of America. So this year specifically, I think it really hit home for all of us why we're preserving the house and why we want to tell these stories. And it's really a huge, I would say, a huge turning point, obviously, in Florida history, and then eventually American history, is the Spanish coming to St. Augustine and the start and development of St. Augustine. But the other side of it is we hit another really big turning point in Florida history, and that would be with Florida tourism. And our house is really one of the first examples of that, being a boarding house. Florida becomes American territory in 1821. So what happens is all the Spanish that are living in St. Augustine decide, we'd rather remain under Spanish government, we're gonna leave, we're gonna move to Cuba. So they leave. What happens is, now there's a bit of an opening in St. Augustine. Northern Americans start looking at Florida as the perfect winter destination, and we have the original snowbirds who starts traveling down to Florida, ideally wanting to stay for the winter season. They're usually staying, we'll say maybe like November to April, so a few months, again, mostly the winter, trying to escape those harsh winters from up north. So as Hannah mentioned, Margaret Cook coming in and starting a boarding house was a really smart business move, because all these people then needed a place to stay. And it wasn't just Margaret Cook, but Eliza Whitehurst made the house a success. We literally have records of someone quoting in the newspaper, it was the best day in St. Augustine. Then Sarah Petty Anderson comes in with a successful boarding house. Ximenez-Fatio comes in and keeps it a successful boarding house. And we have all these people traveling, but it's really that first wave of tourism. Hannah mentioned a little bit where it comes from, health tourism. Health tourism was a really big part of it. A lot of people thought, again, the heat and humidity of Florida would cure respiratory illnesses like tuberculosis. We now know it's not true, but that's what brought a lot of people to Florida, was health tourism, and it was people thinking they could come to Florida and heal. Also had a lot of artists, writers, naturalists, people who wanted to experience a different environment here in Florida. Obviously, a lot of our wildlife here is very different than it is up north. So you had artists and writers who wanted to be able to paint, draw, and write about different experiences and different things that they were seeing, really looking for more creative inspiration. You had a lot of naturalists who wanted to come down here and study all the different plants and animals. So it had a lot of people who were traveling down here, and slowly but surely people realized, I kind of enjoy a 72-degree day in February. That's really nice. Or, I love in the winter that I can go pick fruits from the garden still and everything's not frozen and dead. So people slowly but surely started finding all these things they loved about Florida, and then eventually, who pops in? Henry Flagler. He comes to stay. His wife is actually sent to Jacksonville because she's ill. He does a little day trip down to St. Augustine. He realizes really the potential that there is in St. Augustine, decides to start building his hotels, and then that's where we see the bigger shift in Florida tourism as it starts to become more what it is today, and it continues to shift. Then all of a sudden, we get Walt Disney, and it just continues to grow and grow and grow. But in order to understand where we are now, when we look back, it all starts with places like our small little boarding house that was holding maybe 23 guests, and now we're holding too many people. So, but that's if we're trying to really understand Florida history, that's really where it starts. But on a bigger scale, it's like understanding American history, this blend of cultures and how we got where we are. Looking at Florida, looking at St. Augustine is an excellent place to look. So that's really the biggest reason why we want to preserve our house. And really pretty much our mantra is every room has a story. And if you were to tour through our house, that's really how we said it. Every room represents a different type of guest who is staying or a different part of the house. And we talk about a different role in running a house like that, or a different type of visitor that would be here, or the owner's families and what they would have been like. But I always like to say, not only does every room have a story, but the house is the story. When we look at how we preserve the house, looking at the actual physical structure of the house tells us so much information. And when we look at what the Dames did, really every year that they spent in the house, it became more evident how important it was that they were preserving this place. The more history they learned and the more they learned about the owners and the people that were here. The other side of that is the more time they spent at the house and every year they put into it, the more they realized it was going to take a lot more effort every year to keep the house going. So the next thing I really want to talk about is how do we preserve the house? These are some images from the earlier years of preservation. Really where it started, when the Dames get to the house, one of the biggest things to assess is we want to save this place, we want to turn it into a museum. Is it safe for people to go through? So one of the first steps is trying to restore some of that structure, making it safe, making it a good place for people to actually walk through and tour. This picture I have here on my right, your left, it's actually a scan of a scrapbook that they took pictures. This would have been in 1941, 1942. Pictures they took of the balcony of the house. And you can kind of see, sort of, but here, there's no railings here, there's no railings. Pretty much this whole balcony, this whole side of the house, no railings. It's just not a safe structure. So really the initial part is let's look into how do we make this safe, how do we even turn this into a place that people can walk through. Part of that comes to the structure itself. And then the other side, Hannah had mentioned it, we want to have stuff in the house for people to look at. They don't want to go through a bunch of empty rooms. So really dedicating themselves to go to local antique stores, other museums, even reaching out to their own grandparents or family members for donations, and also eventually being able to get in contact with quite a few descendants of our original owners who were able to donate items to the house. Hannah had mentioned our large cheval mirror is owned by, it's one of very few items we have that's either owned by or connected to one of our original owners. But we're grateful that we've had different descendants from Sarah Petty Anderson and different Fatio descendants who have been able to donate items throughout the house. So we have family pieces throughout the house as well, which is really cool. So that's really where it started, was finding the furnishings, getting the house safe. What eventually happened is they realized the reason there's not a lot of coquina structures around is because it's not easy to take care of coquina structures. One of the things that makes it difficult, if you all felt the coquina, it's really sturdy. There's a reason the fort was made out of it. They were shooting cannons into it and it wasn't cracking. So it's really sturdy, it's really great. But one of the reasons it was so great for the fort and it was so sturdy in that sense is because coquina is very porous. So we're in Florida, we get a lot of humidity, we get a lot of rain, our ground is really wet. So the coquina can preserve a lot of water. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but also coquina is preserving water. One thing with our house, it's a house, so you have windows with wood frames and balconies and other openings. The wood can rot, this can rot, that. There was an idea, this would be more, one of our, I don't want to say preservation fails, because it taught us what we know we need to do today, but there was a thought, coquina is really hard to maintain, the house is hard to maintain. It seems like the issue is because it's porous and it's water. Why don't we waterproof the house? So, how did they decide to waterproof the house? Let's cover the whole thing with Portland cement stucco and latex paint. Now, to a lot of people, and a lot of houses, that might sound like a really good idea. The problem is, they were saving the house from water in the sense maybe the air or rain. But they're forgetting they're going to get a lot of water from two places. One, the ground. It's going to absorb water. Then what's going to happen? It can't evaporate out because it's now been waterproofed. So two things are going to happen. It's either just going to keep going up into the house and mildew and moisture is just going to build in the house, or it's going to find its escape routes, which is going to be in the frames around windows and doors and into the wood, and then the wood is going to rot a lot faster. The problem is, when you do something like Portland cement stucco, the issues with it are not immediately present. So you're not going to do that and then next year realize, oh, we made a mistake. It's going to take a lot of time before you realize that that is what is causing the house more issues. By the time they realized it was causing the house more issues, it had caused a lot of issues, realized it was probably best to remove it, quite expensive to remove it. So they went basically through this phase, I'm going to say mostly 1970s, 1980s, where they decided to dedicate a lot of time and effort and money to get some of the best heads in architectural history and preservation to come out, look at the house, work on the house, and really make a plan for how it should be interpreted, how it should be preserved, how really they should be presenting it to people, and what are the best ways to take care of it. That's where they started doing some projects to really, I would say, bring the house maybe back more to its original form. There were some things that had been changed over the years, and they really started to investigate what the house was and what they could do with it. This picture here, you can see on your right, that's someone removing plaster from the house. The picture on the bottom, they're removing some of that stucco off the kitchen, so the kitchen's bare. The picture at the top there, that's actually an issue that might unfortunately be forever recurring. The balcony gets hit a lot from big trucks going down. That's one of the examples in the 50s of them repairing the balcony. I think I mentioned it earlier, the balcony I think was hit like 9 times in the 50s and 60s. And then that's when they realized it probably was more of a city issue of needing to have low clearance signs earlier on the street. It's something we still face now. The balcony occasionally will get a hit or a scrape every now and then. But started paying more attention into what they could do on a larger scale to also prevent some of this stuff from happening. So removing the stucco, that was kind of an example of one of the fails of preservation. Realizing, let's get a low clearance sign from the city at the top of the street. One of the successes, so you're not having to replace the balcony 9 times in a decade. They started doing a lot more work to really understand the house and understand what they were working with. The picture here on top left, that is a woman doing paint sample analysis. So they're actually going through and looking at every layer of paint to find out what paint colors they were using. That's what helped determine how they were painting the house. The middle picture there, they're actually drilling into a wood beam to do dendrochronology, so they're checking the age of the wood. They did that throughout the house. We learned our main staircase, the original wood. So our main staircase is 228 years old. It's the original wood. The wood all throughout the second floor, third floor of the house is the original wood. The wood on this second story extension up here dated to 1850. So then we thought, okay, that extension was then put in by Sarah Penny Anderson or Ximenez-Fatio to be additional rooms for boarders in the boarding house. That whole section of the house actually is wood rather than the coquina. So really started looking into the house in that way, started telling us more about it. You can't really see in these pictures, you can see the balcony is open. They actually found it was originally enclosed. They found notches all along the wall where there would have been screens. There's actually baseboards on the hallway, the way you would put on an interior hallway rather than an exterior hallway. And then they started looking and found old paintings of the house from 1870s, 80s, and it's painted enclosed. So started learning a little bit more about what the structure looked like. We're obviously voting to keep it open today, need some airflow. There's no air conditioning in the museum. You can see some scaffolding there. They're repairing the chimneys. Something that's coming back around again, we get a lot of birds in the house because they nest in the chimneys. Unfortunately, we'll come in and we find baby birds roaming throughout the house that have fallen from the nest. So there's always going to be work on the house. This picture here on the bottom is actually from 2 years ago. It's replacing that extension on the balcony. Unfortunately, the wood there does get a lot of rain. There's not really too much we can do about it, so that's something that does have to be replaced. One thing that's really great about the team we have, they don't do things the modern way, so everything's going to be done the way they mill the wood or the tongue and grooves and how they get everything all together. They're doing it the historic way, not the modern way. Even all the glazing on the windows, gotta do it the historic way, not the modern way. So we really try and keep everything with the house as historic as we can. And a lot of how we preserve the house, it's gonna come sometimes from preventative measures and then sometimes from bigger restoration projects. So something like the balcony or having to repair the chimney caps, like I said, those are things that we're probably forever going to have to do. Any house built today is obviously still going to have problems. There's never going to be a house that you build that never needs any work on it. But the biggest thing for us as far as preserving the house and the thing we want to keep intact the most is the coquina. That's one of the things that makes our house so special. Again, I said one of only probably 31 remaining coquina structures in St. Augustine. And we now have learned Portland cement stucco is not the way to do it. So in this time that they spent really looking into the house and trying to learn more about the best way to preserve it, they realized when you're working with a limestone, you want to keep everything lime-based. So your plaster, your mortar, your wash should all be lime-based. So that means plastering the house, lime washing the entire house, interior, exterior, and all the coquina. That is expensive and it is tedious work. I want to say not this most recent November, December, but the year before, we had our guest parlor and our dining room recently relimed. They were in there, I want to say, for like 6 to 8 weeks maybe, and that was just to do those 2 rooms. and just the interior of those 2 rooms. And it's one of those things, if it's too cold, lime doesn't go on right. If it's too hot, it doesn't go on right. If you're doing the exterior of the house, if it's raining, can't do it. So there's a lot of environmental factors too that go into being able to do the work. But the lime can be really expensive, the work can be really tedious, and it is difficult to keep up with, but it is something we should be doing every few years because it helps protect the coquina, keeps an outer layer on it so it's not as exposed, but also it helps keep the pH balance of the coquina right where you want it to be. So it's something that we always want to continue doing, but with all the work that's going to happen on the house, whether it be repairing balconies, keeping up with the lime wash, repairing chimney caps, we have to repair the dormers right now. Whatever it is, there's always going to be work, and it's unfortunately always going to be expensive. So the next question that we always get, how do we keep the preservation going? And there's really 3 big ways that we do that. I would say one of the biggest is going to be grants. Going for grant money to get the preservation. We're really fortunate right now that we have a grant from the National Park Service. That's going into a lot of the preservation of the house. Recently I've had money from Americana Corner. I have received money from the Halliburton Foundation as well. And obviously the NSCDA, the organization that owns the house, is going to continue putting money into keeping it there. So having organizations like that that are willing to donate and help preserve the house is a really big part of it. The other side of it is going to be fundraising. We try to get creative with our fundraising the most we can, and keep it fun too. Ryan Brennan, who's one of our staff members who's not here today, I think he did one of the probably the best fundraisers the museum has ever seen, called Hiking Through History. That's the flyer over here. You can actually see him walking along the beach. Hannah talked to you a lot about the Menorcans earlier. She mentioned their exodus from New Smyrna to St. Augustine, which is about a 70-mile walk. Ryan here, who loves to walk, decided he would recreate the walk as a fundraiser for the house. He actually did it twice. He walked the 70 miles from New Smyrna to St. Augustine. All the donations and all the money that he had made from the walk is being put towards the reliming of the house. One of the things I think that was so special about that project, and truly a great idea from him, is one, he got to challenge himself, cool, he got to do the walk, but 2, it raised money for the house, but it did it in a way where he got to highlight an element of history that's not typically highlighted, and a part of our history that for a while we were pretty out of touch with. And in the past few years, because of that, we're really connected with the Menorcan community. We've started doing exhibits in the house to really highlight Juan Pellicer, what life would have been like in a blended Spanish and Menorcan family, what some of their traditions are. We're now planning in the spring, because it'll actually be the 250th anniversary of the Menorcan flight to freedom. It'll be the 250th anniversary of their arrival in St. Augustine. We want to do a Menorcan marketplace where we've invited a bunch of local Menorcans who all have different crafts and skills that have been passed down from their parents and grandparents, to basically set up like a little marketplace all in our courtyard, and they can demonstrate these different skills, whether that be net making for fishing or whether that be meals that they're cooking, whether it's showing how to make Menorcan chowder, whatever it is. And then we're going to do some presentations with the Greek shrine there, to talk about some of the Greeks that were coming over with the Menorcans as well, and even working with Flagler College to have students do some presentations on the Menorcan, Greek, and Italian history in St. Augustine. So really great that we're able to do that, and that leads me to I would actually say maybe the biggest way we preserve the preservation is getting people to care. If you don't have anyone that cares about the history, if you don't have anyone that cares about the property, you're not going to keep it around. As much as you can keep getting grant money, but if no one's touring the house, if no one's visiting, if no one cares about the history, the house is going to go. And really the way that we try and do that is through a multitude of different tours and experiences at the house. One thing we've learned, especially when we look at, like, think about all the women that Hannah just highlighted in the house, they are all multifaceted women. They come from different backgrounds, different cultures, they had different stories. And their lives, a huge part of it is owning a business, but it's not just being a business owner. All the people in the house, there were different experiences that they had that shaped their lives, and we like to do our best to try and highlight some of these different things through different tours and exhibits. We try and include as much information as we can on our daily tours, but throughout the year we like to change it up a bit. So some examples, I put some flyers here. For example, we just recently did a colonial cooking demonstration. Ximenez Russell, who's actually one of our reenactors, who does one of our specialty tours, she prepared a lot of food and talked about the colonial ways, how they would cook, how the enslaved people would prepare food, what the types of meals were they were eating. And the reason we thought that was so cool to do is food is what set us apart from other places. The reason our boarding house was considered such a nice stay is because when you stayed, you got 3 meals a day and your largest meal was 9 courses. That was your midday meal. So imagine basically Thanksgiving dinner for lunch every single day that you were there. And it wasn't just the quantity of food, but also the quality of food, which was made in our tiny little detached kitchen with nothing but a little stove and a beehive oven. So imagine how long it takes to prepare Thanksgiving dinner today. Now, imagine preparing Thanksgiving dinner for 20-something guests, maybe 30-something guests, in a tiny little detached kitchen with no modern elements for you to use and no air conditioning. So the cooks in our house were super important, and the women who were the cooks in our house really helped set the house apart from other places and were really a huge part of the house's great reputation. So doing a cooking demonstration and highlighting some of those processes we thought was a really cool thing to do, and it's something we'll probably continue doing. Charmin, one of the biggest things she's a part of in our house is our I Lived Here as Well tour. That was a specialty tour we did in Black History Month where we highlighted the lives of the servants and enslaved people here in Florida, or here in our house. And we talked about the different time periods in Florida, whether it be Spanish, pre-Civil War, post-Civil War, how that would have affected those individuals in the house. One of our favorites, I think that'll be coming up soon, our Mortality and Mourning Women in Black tour. As Hannah mentioned to you, quite a few of the women involved in our house were widowed. Back in the 19th century, there were a lot of mourning rituals that took place. A huge part of these women's lives were going to be that they were widowed. One, it brought them this business opportunity that you might not think about today that someone would be granted. But there were really strict mourning rituals then, what you had to wear, how long you had to be in your house, based on different cultures. If you were having a Roman Catholic funeral like Juana Pellicer would have had, if you were all of a sudden dabbling in Victorian spiritualism because you lost your husband in the Civil War and now you're having a seance. There were so many different ways that affected spiritualism and mourning in that time, but especially the restrictions that were put on women. Having to wear all black and stay in your house for 2 years, and all the things that you were in charge of when it came to a funeral. And for the women of our house, that would have been huge, especially there were 3 Seminole Wars in Florida. There was a lot of hospital overflow in St. Augustine, and a lot of those people probably wound up in our boarding house, and there was probably a lot of death witnessed by the women in our house. And at that time, the women who owned the boarding house, it was basically their job to nurse anyone in the house, whether that was a wounded soldier, a tuberculosis patient, or a child with yellow fever. That was a domestic duty at the time, was basically nursing. That didn't really change until really the Civil War, that nursing was seen more as a job. So they probably saw a lot of death, whether it be from children unfortunately dying in the house of yellow fever, those sick tuberculosis patients, and then their husbands. So talking about the mourning rituals of that time and what brought people to different spiritualism practices and things like that, would be a huge part of their lives. And so when people are in the mood to hear some of that stuff, in October, we bring out the Mortality Morning Tour. We'll set the house into mourning and we'll talk about it. And we really try and do different tours and experiences like that throughout the year, because we really want to show all aspects of the lives of people who are in our house, because in order to connect and care with them, you have to relate. And all of us have multitudes of experiences that have shaped our lives and shaped who we are today. So it's not going to be any different for the people of the past. So the more tours we can do, the more experiences we can provide, the more opportunity there is for people to care about and connect with the people in our house. And at the end of the day, if you don't care about the people and you don't care about the house is going to go. And if you don't have the house and you don't have that structure there, you're not giving people this opportunity to walk through and connect to these other stories. So they really go hand in hand. It's like a cycle to keep it going. So we really try our best to do everything we can to get people to care, to find fundraising, get donations, find grants, and really find the best team of people to actually do the work to preserve the house. So we're really small staff at the Ximenez-Fatio house, and we have a small team that we work with, but we're lucky that we have people that care. We're lucky that we have people like you who would come out and listen to a lecture about this place that's 2 hours away. And we really hope that we've convinced you to care today and that you want to come visit the house. So next time you're in St. Augustine or you're looking for a weekend getaway, please come visit us, because we'd love to have you. And thank you for coming out tonight.